Imagine commanding an army so poorly equipped and outnumbered that your own generals quietly expect defeat. Now, imagine turning that same army into the most feared fighting machine in Europe, not by brute force, but by thinking differently about war itself. That is exactly what a 16-year-old Swedish king did in the early 1600s. By the time he died on a foggy battlefield in 1632, he had upended the rules of warfare so thoroughly that Napoleon Bonaparte studied his campaigns obsessively, and West Point still teaches his tactics today. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, and the world he left behind looks nothing like the one he entered. In the early 17th century, European armies were still largely fighting in the shadow of medieval tradition. Massive formations of infantry marched in dense, slow-moving blocks called tercios, a Spanish innovation that prized mass over speed, weight over agility. Artillery was heavy and hard to move. Cavalry debated whether pistols or swords were even worth carrying. Into this rigid, sluggish world stepped Gustavus Adolphus II, King of Sweden, 1594 to 1632, a man historians would later call the father of modern warfare. In just over 2 decades on the throne, he transformed a poor, war-exhausted Scandinavian kingdom into a European military power. And along the way, he changed how armies were built, trained, equipped, and fought. This is the story of how one man didn't just win battles. He changed what battles were. To understand how radical Gustavus's contributions were, you first have to understand what he was replacing. For much of the 16th century, European land warfare was dominated by the Spanish Tercio, a massive infantry formation of up to 3,000 men, bristling with pikes and muskets, arranged in deep, slow-moving squares. The Tercio was hard to crack from the front, but it had real weaknesses. It was slow, inflexible, and impossible to maneuver quickly. Battles became grinding affairs between these human fortresses, often decided more by attrition than by skill. Artillery existed, but it was cumbersome. Large, heavy cannons required hours to reposition. Once placed at the start of a battle, they stayed there. Cavalry, meanwhile, had largely abandoned the direct charge in favor of the caracole, ride toward the enemy, fire a pistol, wheel away, reload, and repeat. It looked disciplined. It decided almost nothing. No one had yet assembled all the emerging pieces, better guns, better drill, better coordination, into a coherent system. That synthesis became Gustavus's defining contribution. When Gustavus Adolphus ascended the Swedish throne in 1611, he was 16 years old. He inherited a country that was poor, sparsely populated, and already fighting 3 wars simultaneously, against Russia, Denmark, Norway, and his cousin, the Polish king Sigismund III Vasa. What Sweden had going for it was its king. Despite his age, Gustavus had already experienced combat firsthand and was a serious student of military history. Reading everything from ancient Roman tactics to the recent innovations of Maurice of Nassau and the Dutch army. He spoke multiple languages, corresponded with scholars and commanders across Europe, and had a gift for getting soldiers to follow him, not out of fear, but out of genuine loyalty. His chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, who would become his closest advisor, later wrote that Gustavus possessed a mind that could hold both the grand strategic picture and the smallest tactical detail at the same time. He saw what a modern army could look like, and he set out, methodically, to build one. Before Gustavus could change how his army fought, he had to change who was in it. He dissolved the old system of calling up men only when war broke out and replaced it with formal national conscription. Records kept by local churches tracking every able-bodied man between ages 18 and 40. This created a standing, professional army. Not a mob assembled in a crisis, but a permanent force that drilled together in peacetime and fought together in war. Regular pay mattered enormously here. Mercenaries, who made up much of every European army at the time, routinely switched sides, deserted, or mutinied when wages dried up. Gustavus made sure his men were paid consistently, which built unit cohesion and trust. He was also known to walk through camp himself, checking on conditions, talking to common soldiers by name, sharing their food. It was not theater. He genuinely cared, and his troops knew it. His army had a morale that other commanders envied and couldn't quite explain. The most immediately visible change Gustavus made was to artillery, and it was dramatic. Traditional field cannons were essentially siege weapons dragged onto open ground. They were heavy, required large crews, and once positioned at the start of a battle, couldn't realistically be moved. Gustavus worked with his engineers to develop genuinely mobile field guns, lighter, faster to set up, and capable of being repositioned mid-battle in response to what was actually happening. His crews trained to move and reload quickly under pressure, treating the cannon not as furniture, but as a weapon that could follow the fight. The practical result was artillery that accompanied infantry advances rather than watching from a distance. Cannons became part of the battle's flow, softening a position before infantry moved in, then rolling forward again. That was new. That mattered. Gustavus's most important contribution, the one that everything else fed into, was his insistence on combined arms warfare. The core idea, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, should not operate in separate spheres. They should work together continuously, each supporting the others. In practice, artillery would soften an enemy position. Infantry would fix the defenders in place. Cavalry would exploit openings or protect flanks. Then mobile artillery would roll forward again. Each arm compensated for the other's weaknesses. This wasn't improvised coordination. It was doctrine, drilled into every unit until it became instinct. And it required something the old system didn't: soldiers who understood and respected the other arms of the military. Gustavus made sure his cavalry knew how artillery worked and vice versa. He wanted a force that could think, not just march. The infantry reforms were straightforward in concept, but significant in impact. Where the Spanish Tercio packed thousands of men, dozens of ranks deep, Gustavus flattened his formations to around 6 ranks. Shallower lines meant more musketeers could fire at once, increasing overall firepower without increasing the number of men. Units became smaller and easier to maneuver, able to pivot or advance without the coordination nightmares that plagued the massive Tercio blocks. For cavalry, he had even less patience for the status quo. The caracole, that cautious circular pistol and retreat dance, struck him as a waste of what horses and riders were actually good for. He retrained his cavalry to charge in lines with swords drawn, crashing into enemy formations at speed. Only the front rank fired pistols before contact. The rest relied on momentum and steel. There's something telling in how personally Gustavus approached this. He had taken a serious wound to his shoulder years earlier, bad enough that he could no longer wear full plate armor without pain. He fought without it anyway. When his cavalry charged, he was usually at the front. His men knew that the king wasn't watching from a hill. He was right there with them, and it changed how they fought. Every theory has to survive contact with reality. Gustavus's faced its first real test at the Battle of Breitenfeld on September the 17th, 1631. Arguably the most consequential engagement of the entire 30 Years' War. The opposing commander was Count Tilly, a veteran of 40 years of European warfare, leading a seasoned imperial Catholic force of around 31,400 men. Gustavus had roughly 40,000 with his Saxon allies, but early in the battle, those allies broke and ran, leaving the Swedish left flank completely exposed. This was the moment the old system would have collapsed. A gap in the line, a panic spreading unit to unit, an army dissolving. Instead, the Swedish brigades did something almost no army of the time could do. They reorganized under fire. Small, well-trained units pivoted and filled the gap. Mobile artillery was repositioned within minutes. When Tilly's cavalry came around to exploit the opening, they found it closed. Then Gustavus went on offense. Coordinated counterattacks, artillery pressure, cavalry on the flanks. Exactly the system he had spent a decade building. Tilly lost over 16,000 men, killed or captured. It wasn't just a Swedish victory. It was a demonstration, visible to every observer and commander in Europe, that the old way of fighting was finished. After Breitenfeld, Gustavus swept further into Germany, winning the Battle of the River Lech and pushing deep into Habsburg territory. Protestant Europe, which had been losing the 30 Years' War badly, began to breathe again. Then came Lützen. On November 16, 1632, Gustavus led his cavalry into battle on a foggy morning near the town of Lützen. Visibility was almost nothing. Somewhere in the murk, he became separated from his escort. He was shot, unhorsed, and killed in the chaos. His body found stripped among the dead, identified only by his distinctive features. He was 37. His troops won the battle anyway, which says something about the system he had built. But Europe felt the loss immediately. The Protestant cause lost its most capable champion. Sweden lost a king who had turned a marginal northern state into a continental force. And military history lost one of its most restless, inventive minds before he had finished everything he was working on. The influence of Gustavus Adolphus didn't fade after Lützen. It compounded. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had no shortage of confidence in his own military thinking, specifically listed Gustavus among the handful of commanders every serious officer must study in depth. He wasn't paying a courtesy compliment. Napoleon's own use of mobile artillery, his emphasis on speed and maneuver, his insistence on combined arms coordination, all of it traces a direct line back to Swedish doctrine from the 1620s. George S. Patton studied him too. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point built his campaigns into its core curriculum, where they remain. Beyond tactics, Gustavus established something more fundamental, the idea of the professional national army, permanently standing, regularly paid, drilled to a common standard, loyal to the state. Before him, most European armies were ad hoc collections of mercenaries hired for a specific conflict. After him, that model gradually gave way to the standing armies that became normal across the continent within a century. What makes his legacy durable is that his reforms worked not because of his personal presence on the battlefield, though that mattered, but because they were embedded in doctrine, training, and organizational structure. When he died, the system continued. That's the mark of a genuinely transformative military thinker. The ideas outlast the man. Gustavus Adolphus inherited a struggling kingdom with a mediocre army, and, in 20 years, produced something Europe hadn't seen before, a military force that thought as well as it fought. His artillery moved, his infantry fired in coordinated volleys, his cavalry charged, and all three did it together, in support of each other, as a system rather than three separate arms hoping for the best. The title, Father of Modern Warfare, gets applied too casually to too many people. In Gustavus's case, it holds up. The armies that came after him, through the 18th century, through Napoleon, through the industrial wars of the 20th century, all inherited core principles that trace back to what he worked out in Sweden and proved on German battlefields in the early 1630s. He didn't live to see any of it, but he'd built it to last without him. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe, because every week we dig into the moments that didn't just change battles, but changed history itself. Drop a comment below. Which commander do you think we should cover next?